Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Inside Movies Galore. I'm your host, David Streggy, and here we have another very cool discussion for you tonight. But at the moment, I'm going to hand you off to a very cool host, Dane. Hello.
Hello, everyone. And tonight's film is Stanley Kubrick's horror masterpiece from 1980, The Shining. Synopsis is as follows. I'm going to read this as dramatically as possible. A family heads to an isolated hotel for the winter, where an evil spiritual presence influences the father into violence, while his psychic son sees horrific forebodings from both past and future. Um, that's a very brief, luckily spoiler-free synopsis of the film, which was adapted from Stephen King's novel. And the Stanley Kubrick had a role in the script, writing the adaptation. And for Stephen King fans, people on that side of the fence tend to not like this adaptation, while fans of Stanley Kubrick, and I am one of those diehard fans, tend to love it. So we're gonna, I think, hear from all sides of the conversation. But why don't we start with Katie? See what she thinks.
Sure. Well, this was a rewatch for me. I don't know. I've seen the movie several times over the years. My mom, as I've mentioned before on the podcast, my mom's a Stephen King fan, so I always seem to stumble on the movies that were adapted from Stephen King novels or whatever, growing up as a kid. So this was one, I don't know, it must have been on TV, I think probably the first time I saw it, because I want to say that it was The Shining and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Tim Burton's Batman that really, like, all really turned me on to Jack Nicholson. Like, he was one of my favorite actors when I was a kid. He just really stood out to me. And as I grew up, I didn't follow his work real closely, but those were always the movies that stuck out to me. So I sort of remember The Shining for that, and for Jack Nicholson's performance, and just the story overall. And I would say it's probably been close to 10 years since the last time I actually watched this movie all the way through. And I watched it this time with, my movie podcaster critical eye, and saw a lot more that I never noticed about it before. And of course, I did a little digging into Kubrick and all of that, and like his filmmaking style and stuff. And yeah, I think I enjoyed the movie even more knowing all of those things and sort of looking at it from an artist perspective. So it was like watching it again for the first time, almost, just because of the way I watched the film this time, with kind of just the things that I've been learning about filmmaking influencing how I saw it. So I enjoyed it overall.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Well, all Kubrick films, the artistry factor is critical and very heavily layered, and we'll get into that as we go. But let's see what Dustin thought of the film.
So, well, I'm ready to go. I've got my axe. So, haha. So I had seen The Shining is one of those films that you grow up hearing a lot about. Like, people will be like, "Oh, it's the best horror movie ever." Like, if you ask more or less like anybody on the street, like, what do you think the best horror movie is? You'll get answers like The Exorcist or The Shining in many cases, to the point where it can kind of make the movie a little bit less enjoyable, because at least in my experience, like, a lot of times that comes with some kind of level of pretentiousness. It's like, oh, well, Kubrick is the most perfect director of all time, so of course The Shining is the best movie of all time. It's like, well, whatever horror movies have you seen? I only need to see The Shining. Actual thing someone told me once. So I came kind of back to The Shining. I mean, I've seen it before, and I remember being kind of, I don't exactly want to say not impressed. Like, it's definitely a good movie, but it didn't like knock my socks off the way it did for everybody else. But coming back to see it again for, I think maybe the fifth or sixth time today, it held up a lot better than I remembered. I mean, there are still things where, I mean, I don't think it's like the greatest work of all time. Like, I think I'm gonna make so many people so mad. Like, I think I had a better time watching like Jaws 3 than I did The Shining.
Well, you're not alone in that, because when the movie first came out, it was not universally praised, and in fact, Kubrick at the very first Razzies got a Worst Director nomination, which is absolutely hysterical. But I mean, it definitely. Well, it definitely got a mixed reception when it first came out, particularly Stephen King fans, which I do believe that David, who we're going to hear from next, I do believe that he's one of the detractors for the film on some of those same grounds. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I guess I have a more personal relationship with The Shining, because I always grew up with my mom. She's not into horror films at all. But on a side note, she always told me a story. And the first time I heard this was when I was 5 years old, and she said she was downtown reading The Shining. And she was working for an accountant firm at the time. And all of a sudden, she got to the room, part in the room, in the 237, and all of a sudden, she had to look up suddenly and close the book and look around and see where the fuck she was. So, to me, at 5 years old, I was like, cool. And my dad just so happened to have a copy of that old shiny paperback, so I went downstairs, and I was actually very well read by the first book that I had ever read, and I was 4, was little Louisa May Alcott's Little Men. So I could actually read fairly well at that age. So I read The Shining, and it scared the shit out of me. But then I read it later when I was a teen. So when I had heard that there was an adaptation of the film from the 1980s, I watched it, and man, did I hate it. And maybe it's because I was more by that time a fairly avid lover of Stephen King. I'd read the book. I mean, it wasn't until later that I had actually seen this film several times that I had actually, come to appreciate it a little bit more. But I still have this unnerving sensation that this film was not made for Stephen King. It was not. I understand the guy was coked out through most of his film career, but but
who's Stephen King?
Kubrick was coked out, or
no?
He was
Kubrick was a very just hardworking kind of guy. Now you're referring to the fact that Stephen King was a raging alcoholic for a lot of his life, and him trying to get sober was what prompted writing The Shining.
Said that he was there is an actual documentary, believe it or not. I can't think of the name, but I became aware of it several years ago, where he actually says that he was actually doing cocaine at the time that he was filming and directing Maximum Overdrive.
Oh well, I knew that. That's a different movie though. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves.
I enjoyed that movie.
Let's see what Kotobuki Jake thinks of The Shining.
All right. Well, first of all, I do think it's funny that Dustin mentioned Jaws 3, because that's one of the few movies that I've always hated more than I ever hated The Shining. But at any rate, I consider myself a pretty big fan of both Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick. I do consider myself a student of both film and literature, and so I hold both of them in very high regard. And with Kubrick, I've seen every one of his films since The Killing. I've not seen the first few, but I've seen everyone from The Killing on, and only three of them gave me a very strong, strong, strong reaction the first time. I loved A Clockwork Orange. I loved Doctor Strangelove, and I hated The Shining. But part of that was because I had read the Stephen King novel shortly before. I think I saw the TV miniseries, and that was what prompted me to read the novel, I think. Uh, if I saw the miniseries first, that might be why I liked it more. I have to see, I haven't seen it in years. But I love the book The Shining. I love it. I like King as a writer. I think he does a great job. And to put it bluntly, the movie The Shining is a butchery of the book. But if you look at it as a Kubrick film, I've seen the film more than any other Kubrick film except for Doctor Strangelove. This was at least the third, probably the fourth time I've seen The Shining. And I actually saw it in theaters once. I actually went to see a midnight showing. So I've seen it, and each time I can look at it more as a Kubrick film and less as a Stephen King adaptation. And it does benefit from that. But as an adaptation, it's one of the all-time worst. But as a film, it's pretty good. It's
and that's again, that's a pretty common reaction. I'll dive into that some more after we've heard from Brandon.
All right. As far as The Shining, I have an interesting history with it. I have seen The Shining the most of any of the Kubrick films that I've seen, and I've seen a fair number in my time. And oddly enough, with my favorite being Eyes Wide Shut, followed by Doctor Strangelove. When I first saw The Shining, I was 7 or 8 years old, and I had never really watched anything horror before. My father said, you know, this would be a neat film to show a really young child. And I remember having nightmares for a long time after that. But considering that the two films that he showed me when I was that young back to back was that one and Barfly with Mickey Rourke.
Heck is Barfly?
It's a hard film to find, but it's a fun one. Not so fun for a 7-year-old though, because it's a film about an alcoholic.
So is The Shining.
I had my actual dad. I had enough of that.
So the film was very scary when I first saw it, and I gained a total aversion to horror because of that film. Matter of fact, I did not watch anything horror until I was in college because of that film. Then I watched it again, Confront Your Fears and all that, and I said, oh, this is not scary, really. And as I learned, though I don't consider myself a student of film per se, I've seen many, many films, and I've learned many, many things, watching commentaries and all of that. I really never consider myself an expert or even worthy of being a student of any of it. But the more I got to know about that, the less and less I liked the film. And what's also odd is that after the recent watch through and the research I did into it, I liked the film even less after that. Which will go into reasons that I can discuss later on.
Yeah.
But there is a method to my madness. It's the same reason why I have a beef with Fellini and 8.5, which is a tale for a later day.
Yeah. Well, as we're into that subject, so as we've established, the reception to the film initially was very mixed from Stephen King fans and from the general moviegoers, and even from Kubrick's contemporaries. There were a lot of people that he talked to subsequently who didn't like it at first, and afterwards saw a lot more underneath the surface the more times they watched it. One of those people was actually Steven Spielberg. Felt that Jack Nicholson went over the top and in his performance, and Stanley Kubrick told him to name his favorite actors, and he did. And he named like Jimmy Stewart and Spencer Tracy and a lot of the greats from the old days, except that he said to Stanley said to Steven Spielberg, he was like, well, why isn't James Cagney on there? And he said, that's the difference between you and I, is that you don't consider James Cagney one of the top 5 best actors, and I do. And I get where he was coming from, because if you've seen other older films of James Cagney, he can play really alluring psychotic characters, which then leads you to the next part of the discussion, which is about the fact that Kubrick would often adapt novels into films, and he would usually pick novels that were either okay or weren't that well known, or were lesser works by a great author, like The Luck of Barry Lyndon by William Thackeray, which is not as well known as Vanity Fair, for example. He would take the pieces of it, like the good pieces, and would build his own Kubrickian narrative on it. And in this case, with The Shining, he's taking a ostensibly supernatural story and kind of whittling it down to its essence, which is ultimately about family dynamics and about essentially the perils of an unstable father. And there are a lot of apocryphal stories about what went into his conception of this film, but there is a reason why it's not going to necessarily please anyone, because Kubrick's process was to take an existing work and make it his own. He is not the kind of person to do a straight up faithful adaptation of anything, which you either can like or not. And as you can probably tell, I am a big fan of Kubrick. He's my artistic inspiration as a director and a writer. And I have seen The Shining many times. It is not one of my personal favorites of his, even though I love every single one of his films. I have other ones I like more, but it's definitely worth discussing because it has so many layers to it. Which then brings us into how we feel the plot works in and of itself. And for those of us who've read the book, how it compares and all that stuff. So whoever wants to jump in.
Actually, I do have something real quick. So I found this at Goodwill, of all places, last year. It is what I think is an actual first print of The Shining. I kind of forgot I had it until someone brought up the book, and I was like, wait, don't I have that somewhere?
I think that is the original cover.
So, looking at the information, I have a much better camera, so sorry for the quick bit of troubleshooting a moment ago. But it has fairly extensive water damage, which is a real shame, but it can still be read, the pages are separated. So I just felt that was a worthwhile artifact to bring up.
Absolutely. Well, I know to set the groundwork here for the plot side of things. I know that Stanley Kubrick, that Stephen King's original intention was to have a story about a man who's trying to do the right thing for his family by kicking alcoholism, but these evil forces are pushing him back into this dark place, and the film is in that same place, except that the big difference is the portrayal of Jack Torrance. So I mean, plot and character kind of intertwine in this story in a way that the characters really do drive this plot forward, because otherwise they're just taking care of an inn and that's it. So we can kind of discuss those together.
What do we about? Do we want to talk about the plot of the movie, or do we want to?
I think
talk
Katie.
about
I think Katie was trying to mention something, Dave.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to say was that there are a lot of different theories on the plot, and some of the inner workings of what's actually going on. And I really did pick up on the whole alcoholism thread that sort of ran through the dynamic with the family. Like I've heard a lot of things criticizing that some of the characters, because I've never read the book, so I don't have anything to go off of that way, but I've heard that the portrayal, like particularly Jack's character, sort of moves into insanity kind of quickly in the movie versus in the book. Um, but I feel like it's really representative of a dry drunk, somebody who's not actually drinking, but not really addressing their alcoholism either, and how that dynamic was affecting his family, his wife specifically. Like, I thought, I've heard complaints about her character as well, being, that Kubrick has a very misogynistic take on his characters, and that, the character of Wendy was very, I don't know, she wasn't a strong female character, I guess, you would say. But I felt like she was a really great representation of an alcoholic's wife, especially in, late 1970s, early 1980s, where you still sort of have that dominant, submissive dynamic going on, where it's not like it is today, where, you're a lot more likely to speak up, or even looking at if she's an abused wife, which clearly she would have been, not having the wherewithal to stand up to her husband. And I thought that dynamic played into the plot really well, and how he was able to get to the point that he got to.
Well, that's right. Well, and you're absolutely right about, I think that interpretation of Jack Torrance is someone who clearly, has something, that great vice, and is trying to hold it together, and that, wanting it in isolation, that kind of can drive one to madness when you have that kind of addiction. Two themes that pervade the movie to varying extents are the idea of fairy tales. Like the wife mentions, Wendy, she mentions a trail of breadcrumbs to get out of the maze. And also there's the theme of Native American genocide and American expansionism, which is pretty interesting. That could be a whole discussion in and of itself, but that's just another good little thing to throw in there, just to see the kinds of additional things that Kubrick is able to bring out in this basic framework.
So,
But yeah, what else do we have to say about plot and characters?
I was gonna say it's kind of interesting to hear all these like really deep reads into the plot, because I mean I viewed this as basically just like a straight up like haunted house story.
I think that's how it's written, like on the page. But I do think that's the genius of Kubrick has always been his ability to fill each frame with many layers of meaning, a lot of which are very subtle, and especially with how a shot is constructed and what props are in the frame, how are they positioned, and actually. What's really interesting is that in between certain cuts of the like each edit of the film, that the props, the furniture and stuff does get slightly rearranged, or like in the first vision that Danny has, we see the girls dead on the floor, but if you look at the shots back to back, the girls move ever so slightly. So the point is that, and that's across Kubrick's films. So with each film that you watch of his, they're always ripe for analysis, because he was the kind of person to extract meaning in every department because he was such a versatile filmmaker.
One of the things that makes
Oh.
the book a little bit different than the film is the fact that little Danny, he actually envisions everything that's going to happen, including what happens in the house. Not just the visions of the so-called entities in the house, but everything that is to come, even the foreshadowing of the boilers that explode in the very end, which did not happen in the movie, but happened in the book.
Yeah.
So
Right.
Well, there are a lot of little things that are
And he
in the
did-
movie that I think had an explanation in the book, if I recall.
and
I think
he
there's-
saw all of this way before he even got to the house or got to the hotel. So that is one big major factor, according to the book, to the movie, because I mean, yeah, he still sees visions as he gets to the house, but he sees everything foreplayed in his mind before they even reach the darn place.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the one thing that's kind of interesting is you talk about how Kubrick stuffs everything with visual meaning, with artistic shots and all this kind of stuff. Um, but it's kind of interesting and kind of ironic that Stephen King does the same thing with his writing. His characters are very full, they're very deep, they have a lot of nuance to them. He does use a lot of detail without bogging you down in the detail. The detail of the boiler was a very important plot point in the book that's basically swept to the side in the movie. And I do think that it's kind of interesting and ironic that the characters and the plot have been stripped bare, but all this other stuff has been moved in place of them. Uh, but like
Yeah.
one of the things that I think that I fully agree, I've read that some of King's criticisms of the movie are that Wendy's portrayal is extraordinarily misogynistic. I have always hated that portrayal of that character. I have always hated that portrayal, not just the performance. I don't put it all on Shelley Duvall. The way the character is presented, it's so misogynistic. She's so weak. She's so.
She's
Mhm.
there just to
Oh, yeah.
scream.
Well,
It-
what is
novel, she
funny?
was a very strong woman, and she was a blonde.
Yeah, she was.
So what's interesting about that is clearly a conscious choice. I think that what Katie said was probably a factor there because she is someone who's clearly in denial of her husband's alcoholism, and if you notice her dress, she dresses in a very childlike kind of doll-like manner. She
Right.
almost is like a Raggedy Ann doll. And if you look at it in the broader context of Jack Nicholson as the kind of the American expansionist white male who, talks about the white man's burden and uses racial epithets, and you have again the Native American genocide thing is heavily implied in types of artwork that's on the walls, as well as the fact that it used to be a Native American burial ground and that kind of stuff. So I mean, I think if there is misogyny in there, it's probably to fit that larger theme. As far as Kubrick himself, I think that he, from his own wife was like, that there were few men who knew as much about women as he did. So I don't think it necessarily comes from a place of misogyny in Kubrick himself.
Well, and it's not like these kinds of women or people in general don't exist in the world. They
That's
absolutely
right.
exist, especially in an abusive relationship.
Yeah, well, and it's
Like-
not necessarily bad if one person in a relationship is the stronger or weaker one necessarily. It's just any combination can theoretically work, but
The other point I was going to get to was Jack's character himself. again, in the book, he was a recovering alcoholic. He was trying to, but the struggle was much more apparent. It was much more apparent that he wanted to do good. He worked really hard. They don't really show this in the movie, but in the
Yeah, I
book,
didn't get that from the movie at all.
he worked really hard on maintaining the boiler, doing all the maintenance, the groundwork, all the stuff he was hired to do. He
Mhm.
did do until he started slipping. But in the movie, you get the feeling that he's already slipping when they hire him for the
Well,
job.
yeah. And you don't get a sense of what exactly his job as the caretaker
Right.
is.
Right.
Yeah, it's
I
and
feel
that's
like
that.
They give it all the story.
I'm still trying to talk about like the cinematography.
We'll get there.
Let me ask
Yeah.
quickly: are we on the plot or the characters? Or are we doing both at the same time?
It's
Well-
kind of both because the characters do really drive this plot.
What's
Okay, I was just trying to
interesting-
follow along the script. I wanted to say real quick about the plot. For me, I
Right.
became a Stephen King fan later on, and approached The Shining after watching the movie, which made me look at the movie and not like it as a story. And when you talk about plot, the basic story of The Shining is it's a man who hates his life. He hates everything about it. He hates that he is saddled with the family, but he wants to be in that position. And he's mad with this. And this gives him the opportunity to let it go and try and start anew by destroying it all. But that's not really what Kubrick is presenting. Kubrick is presenting a picture. He is an artist trying to portray a picture. So the story itself is almost meaningless in that sense. It is the whole of it all. The representation of the not just the expansionism, but even of the Holocaust. The German typewriter that changes the coloration. The excess use of the number 42. Though I don't buy into the whole like he uses this as his way of saying that he helped fake the moon landing. I don't.
Yeah, that's nonsense.
But if you want to, you could read it in there if you wanted to try and read into it.
I think the most more accurate possible symbolism that he might be describing is the genocide of the Indians.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's the whole joy for me of Kubrick, besides the fantastic artistry, the brilliant command of every aspect of filmmaking to fit a single vision, the fact that his films are so rich with different levels of meaning and interpretation, and there's no right answer necessarily. There's all kinds of ways that one can look at it.
And that's the thing that frustrates me more about Kubrick, actually, which is where we differ in that sense, is there is a pretentiousness and an arrogance in his work.
Thank you so much.
Such an intelligent individual. And as somebody who can look at these things and also looks at it as also a way of belittling all of the rest of the people that are around to look at this. And I could see that as a way of lording over all of the other people, saying, I am much more intelligent. I mean, shoot, Barry Lyndon was the most boring thing I'd ever watched.
Are you kidding me? Barry Lyndon is one of my favorite movies. But I think...
But again, that's a good thing, though. But again, you can gain joy from that. And I'm not trying to say this to be mean necessarily. Try not to take it that way.
No.
But if we're looking at my own interpretation of it, I look at this as that arrogance and pretentiousness, which comes from somebody with a high intelligence and a high meaning in art. Fellini is the same way. That's the reason why I always made the joke. You can't have a perfect 10 in art unless it's directed by Fellini, because you don't have the pretentiousness level that can get it up to that point. But as the idea is, I feel like sometimes you lose the forest for the trees. I mean, I have extra notes on the characters, but I will step back for a moment.
Yeah, and
Well, it's,
that speaks to a lot of, I guess, kind of my overall opinion of Kubrick. I mean, because just listening to everybody, it's like, oh, there's so many deep layers of meaning, and each shot is designed to be like this. Like you were talking about how like the girls moved like a little bit, like on each between those two shots. Like, is it possible that wasn't deliberate and they just kind of shifted a little bit? I mean,
it is definitely possible,
not
but
everything is.
There are other examples of it, so that's
there's
why I brought it up.
There's another theory
So,
that
plus, another thing too with some of those like some of the early shots, like a lot of them are, I mean, like they show the characters kind of almost more in the background, like they're very, I guess I want to say tall shots where you see like a lot of like the space.
Oh yeah,
and
they're definitely long shots.
I think the idea was, a sense of isolation, but to me it just kind of looked like they looked almost kind of like goofs, like poor framing. Like
I don't follow you there.
I don't either, but the thing is that just very quickly, I think I don't think Kubrick was necessarily intending to lord over people. I don't. I mean, I obviously, he died in 1999, but
I think we're more referring to people that are, I guess, more professionally invested in film criticism, like a lot of people that, like write columns or, I am a serious I'm a serious journalist.
Well, that field does presuppose a certain degree of academic, acumen, I guess. But
there is an interesting theory that I thought was kind of cool. That has been interposed in the plot of this film. That there is a maze in the film, correct?
Yes.
So that in the book, in the book that there was absolutely no maze, right?
They had a topiary garden, which they changed partly for budget, but probably partly for what you're going at.
Well, they're in the scene where you first see the two girls. When Danny is throwing the darts at the dartboard. If you turn around and you look behind the girls, there is a calendar on the wall that shows a skier, and underneath it says Monarch. Now, that skier actually looks like a
Minotaur.
A minotaur. And on the other side, you see a man on a bull. And this kind of relates to supposedly the story of Theseus and the Minotaur in the maze.
That's kind of hilarious, actually. I didn't get that.
Yeah, but again, keep in mind that Kubrick was very, very well read. He would read books obsessively about a specific subject before he would write the script for that particular subject. So, and again, legends, fairy tales, like the old woman in room 237, they've said is sort of like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, which they also reference the Trail of Breadcrumbs and that kind of stuff.
And when Jack Nicholson's character is kind of somewhat roaming down the hall near the gold room, he in fact kind of acts exactly like a bull as he's like charging like that red flag,
Mm-hmm.
So in a sense, I can see, and right near there, there is an unhappy winding hour sign.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that sign might be a representation of the thread of Theseus as he's going through the maze. He has to take a thread and take that down the maze so that he knows exactly where he is in the maze.
It's a good point. I mean, the whole thing with mirrors, there's a lot of mirrors throughout, and that sort of referencing
Every time
the
he sees a ghost, isn't it? Or
yeah,
is, interacting in some way with a ghost, it's always around a mirror.
that's right. And so it's sort of more the idea that the true evil comes from within rather than from ghosts necessarily. Well, very quickly, do we have anything more to say about characters / plot? Because we need to
Oh,
keep
well,
moving.
I
Um,
didn't speak on the characters.
there weren't
Yeah,
that many characters
go
anyway.
ahead.
Although, go Brendan.
The way I looked at it, when you comparatively look at the books, Stephen King was obsessive about characterization. Out of all the things in his writing, he is an expert at making deep characters because these are people that you end up caring about, and that really drives the horror in a lot of his books. Which, with this, the characters in this were, I don't feel like the characters had depth at all. They were mostly caricatures
I thought they were very
of their
relatable.
characters. You see, and I did not. I thought that they were more of caricatures of things. They were more they're more like cartoon characters
I
that
agree.
moved on.
Well, that goes back to Steven Spielberg's critique of the performances as being like kabuki theater.
No, I don't say that that's
really
necessarily.
disagree with that.
Well, if the music hadn't been like so intense, like this movie would have honestly been pretty funny.
But that's the thing, though. I don't think that, you see, and this is the other thing, is I don't consider that necessarily a bad thing when it comes to the context of the film as to what it is. And even though I say I don't like the film, I don't mean to say that it is a bad film. I think it is an excellent film. It is a well-made film. But I do feel like the deep characters is not what he needed to go for. Jack Nicholson's portrayal of Jack Torrance, again, I did not feel that was a good portrayal. Jack Nicholson, it's just like that's like the argument that I've had with Jake a lot about Jack Nicholson doing one of the best Jokers, in my opinion. But it's that same answer. Jack Nicholson is an excellent person at playing insane characters, but that's his baseline. That's what he does. Jack Nicholson doesn't really act when he's doing that. He's acting when he's playing the straight man. He's acting when he's playing the serious person. And I really didn't feel like he got that across at all. I felt like he was ready to kill his family when they were on the drive on the way up. And
in fairness,
he doesn't seem like he was ever a good person. And that he was just a monster pretending to be a man, which could be what Kubrick was going for. But
and they allude to that early on when his wife tells the story about, it's like, oh, he broke Danny's arm this one time. And
Yeah, he dislocated his shoulder.
Dozens of excuses for him. The shoulder. Like, she makes dozens of excuses for him to, what was she, like the social worker or whoever she was talking
to?
to?
The doctor, and that was completely to paint Wendy's character for us, to show us that she's a child abuse sympathizer. She's really
wimp.
Well, yeah, she's, for lack of a better word, she's a wuss, and that was the role that she was meant to play in Kubrick's vision of this story. And again, I don't have a book to compare it to, which is great for me. But
not the vision
felt
that King had.
It doesn't matter.
No, it wasn't. But
it's
yeah,
not
exactly.
Stephen King's movie. It's Kubrick's movie, and that's what he decided to do with it.
Fact,
So it doesn't matter. I felt like her character was relatable in certain senses. I mean, I guess you guys have never been the female in abusive relationships, so I get it. But I've been a female in an abusive relationship before, and her character, I think the reason why it pisses off women is because if you spot it, you got it. If you can relate to that character, that's probably not a really comfortable feeling, because nobody actually wants to be that. So I think it makes people uncomfortable, and that's exactly what movies are supposed to do, and make you feel something. And I felt the characters were relatable, even if there wasn't a ton of depth to them.
I couldn't have said that better, because I mean and that's why I love Kubrick so much, is because he takes you to really dark, uncomfortable places in his films, and that's why I love him so much, because he's kind of the anti-Spielberg in the sense that Spielberg tries so hard to make movies that everyone will love, and often has succeeded, but it's like, okay, that's great, but it's essentially, a popcorn movie, which is fine, but not everything needs to be that. And the best films tend to be the ones that make you feel really uncomfortable. And life has a lot of really uncomfortable, awful things to it, like people that abuse their children or abuse alcohol, abuse their wives, and they, they're that way, and that's life. So I think he and also keep in mind, as far as what Brandon said about characterization, one thing that people either love or hate about Kubrick as a director, which I personally love this, most movies are driven either by the plot or by the characters. In this case, they're both kind of intertwined, but this movie, as well as all of Kubrick's other films, almost entirely are driven by themes. And I really love that. I tend to approach films that and art that same way. I kind of tend to approach it from a thematic, explorative point of view. Now, granted, having great characters and a great plot is part of that, but I think that that's why the characters come across the way that they do, or why people might say, "Oh, she was a weak woman," or whatever. It's like, well, it's all in service of the larger vision.
Absolutely.
Again, I don't want to say that lack of depth means that you can't relate to characters. You can relate to 2D characters, because again, that doesn't make them unrelatable. It just means that they are this. They don't have a lot of nuance to them.
Well, they're never going to have as much nuance as a novel is going to have, just because of obviously a length and
or other movies for that matter. But that's the thing. I agree with you. I agree with you on the themes. I don't think that, and again, I don't think that she was nuanced. I've worked because there's more to a person than the suffering that they go through. Yes, it is a part of it, but who was she as a person? What are her strengths? What are her joys? What are things there? She is that person. That's all she is. That's all she identifies as.
Yeah,
but there is more to a person than that.
Well, but we only see them for such a short time. Like, I feel like it's such a small snippet of their life. We get just enough information that we need in order to relate to them and then to be scared of what's going to happen. I don't think we need to know her whole backstory, like fill in the blank. I don't need to be told. I can imagine it, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, like, if she, played cribbage with the ladies on Sunday or whatever. I mean, I guess if she had some friends, it would be a little different as to her character, but we don't need that to feel like she's helpless in a way. Like, that's the scary part about being hunted down by your own husband.
Well, not only that, but also just the fact that I wouldn't. I kind of do think, in a lot of ways, our experiences as human beings is shaped. Our experiences are shaped by our good experiences and our bad experiences, and within our bad experiences come a lot of suffering. A lot of Kubrick's films, because they deal with such dark subject matter, tend to go into that territory, and that can often be a good shorthand for telling us enough about a certain person in order to get the thing moving. And I say get the thing moving because, and I haven't finished the miniseries version, but there's so much like minute detail in there, which that miniseries was supervised by Stephen King and was his approved version. But it's like, it also, the forward momentum of the plot does suffer. So, I mean, it's a tricky balance, but have we said everything we want to say about character and plot before we get into like the filmmaking aspects?
I don't think anybody touched on oh my god, I forgot his name. The groundskeeper or whatever.
Dick Halloran.
Oh, yeah, Halloran. Yeah, excellent portrayal of the character.
One of my big beefs, one of the reasons why I hated the movie the first time I saw it, was I like Halloran as a character. In the book, in the miniseries, I liked him as a character, and I like Scatman Crothers, and I think he did an okay job with the character in the movie. And I hated the fact that they changed his fate in such a way that did not go well for him. Because they did completely change his fate from the original story. And I did not like that. Now, it definitely fits with that theme of the white man destroying everything in its wake. It definitely fits that theme, but I didn't like that because I liked the character and I didn't like that change.
Well, that's fine. It's again, it goes down to adaptation, and how okay one is with how closely or not one follows, a pre-existing vision.
The one last thing that I wanted to say was as to Shelley Duvall's character. I have always felt personally that Kubrick abused her on the set.
Well, yeah, she
heard
lost
that too.
hair. She lost hair because of the stress he put her under, and keep
I
keep
think he
in
put her
keep in
through
mind that
more than
this.
any other director has ever put anyone through.
Keep in mind that this was during a time when the ability of a director to push his actors to the limit, like in the 70s with William Friedkin pushing his actors on the set of The Exorcist, and with Kubrick, Kubrick would often push his actors pretty far, but I think back then there was also just not as much in the way of, restraining someone's behavior on set, partially because of, there wasn't a lot of the same kind of workplace oversight laws we have today, and there certainly wasn't the social media sphere like there is today. So it was a different time back then. But yeah, he definitely pushed her to her limit. I know that she, said that she didn't ever want to work in that environment again. But I know that she also, spoke favorably of Kubrick as an artist, and
Well, she did.
Recently,
And she also, I paid attention to the documentary that was on whatever, the making of the Shining documentary, and I watched and I read some things about this topic, and what I gathered as a whole is that, I think what Kubrick needed from her in terms of her performance, he wasn't gonna baby her on the set, and he didn't want anybody else to either, because she wasn't going to benefit from being coddled. That's not, that wasn't going to translate. Like some actors, I think whatever, they can go to a place in their head and they can make it happen, whatever it is the director needs from them. And some of them can't, but she had the look and she had the whole thing he wanted, but he had to get her there emotionally. And it wasn't going to happen if he coddled her, and she seemed like the type, just from the comments that she made. I'm a pretty good judge of character, and from the comments that she made and kind of some of the things we saw in the documentary, it was like she was kind of in real life kind of like not the type of person that's really going to pony up and tough it out. It was like if he was hard on her, she was going to take it. She had anxiety attacks and stuff like that, so he used that to his advantage. He pushed her buttons so he could get that reaction out of her, because Jack was pushing her buttons, and that's what he needed to show.
And good directors are able to do that, and each actor has his or her own style, because some of them, like you said, can just turn it on, and then other people have to be pushed. And especially if actors are difficult to work with, then you really do need to push and not play nice. So I can definitely sympathize on that level. Then by contrast, with Danny, forget his last name, but he played Danny
Lloyd
in the movie. Yeah, Danny Lloyd. He it's funny that the Danny and Jack, their real names are Danny and Jack in real life, which is so funny. But he managed to shoot Danny's scenes in such a way that Danny didn't know he was in a horror movie. And I thought, no, that's pretty ingenious. Because, a movie like this, I would have thought would have been pretty grueling on a child. But apparently he was able to do it in such a way that he wasn't, adversely affected, which I know was a big worry that the people who worked on The Exorcist, they were really afraid it was going to mess up, Linda Blair. So, that's pretty impressive in its own right. But David, you were going to say something?
Yep, I was going to say in a recent interview with Dr. Phil, which was not too long ago, actually, because she actually came on Dr. Phil, and he actually offered her
Dr. Phil.
Yep, Dr. Phil McGraw. In any case, she told him that I lost some of my innocence on The Shining because for the first time I felt like I had to have a lawyer.
Ooh.
So
she's also very mentally ill now.
And Katie, I do agree with you because of the relatability. But I think the reason why she was as relatable is she was really being abused. You weren't seeing acting, you were seeing real abuse and real reactions to that abuse. And
perhaps that's the
I
way.
listened to her interview with that, but I have worked with a lot of people. I've given therapy to a lot of people in that situation, and they are going to say these types of things because that's what you do. A lot of these people who were abused by Weinstein couldn't come forward when they were abused. This is not saying sexual abuse, but psychological abuse to me is even worse than physical abuse because psychological abuse hurts you in ways that do not show, that people do not see. And he was relentlessly psychologically abusive to her to get her to be that abused, damaged individual.
I guess I just didn't find any of that anywhere. Like, I was trying to really research it and find out, like, what did he actually do? And the only things I could really find that were documented was that, he told people not to sympathize with her because it doesn't help her.
Well,
he made sure that people did not talk about these things because Kubrick was really secretive about his process. He did not like being filmed. He did not like having his methods talked about.
Which, as a director myself, I can completely understand. I really don't like interference on my sets. I like to run a tight ship.
But that's the question, though, because if you really were like berating somebody and yelling and screaming at them, regardless, if you were telling people keep secret about this, regardless of your methodology, it would still be kept secret. And that's the idea. I don't think any of this stuff would come to light fully because this is stuff that would not come to light.
Has anyone else come forward about it? I mean, is there, because like I said, I just haven't been able to find anything.
I haven't found anything that is as damning as, say, the Harvey Weinstein kind of abuse. I think it was just more because, I mean, from everything I've seen about Kubrick is that he was really a family man, and he was really, just kind of like being in his little world. And, if he's guilty of anything, it's just pushing someone very far to get the performance he wanted. And I guess she didn't have
everything I've heard about Kubrick, kind of off and on and off camera, has given me the impression that he was a douchebag. So
it's about that. It's like those cases that push those players till they're dead. It's that concept of he was pushing and pushing to try and get there.
Well, but also again, keep in mind also that he never was diagnosed in his lifetime, but a lot of people have looked back on Kubrick retroactively and theorized that he had high functioning autism, which was why he liked a very structured environment.
I can easily believe that,
Well, why the shots were perfectly symmetrical, and why he didn't really like to shoot outside of his Hertfordshire environment, and why he would get impatient when people didn't see his vision, how he was a master at so many specific things about perfectionist, all that stuff. It all kind of fits. Plus, he was just obsessive with certain subjects and would single-mindedly pursue them. I mean, those are all pretty telltale signs, all of which I can relate to myself, which again, I think is another thing that connects me to him. So,
and again, I wanted to and to end my thought on her, though I still say that there should be some sort of a conversation about Danny himself as well. But as far as her, the other reason why I considered her that way is I felt like that the portrayal of her was to say that all women who stay in abusive relationships, and I got this from the documentary, they're all weak. That's why they stay in. And that's not true. There are many strong women who end up staying in that sort of thing.
And
that is why the book was more powerful for that characterization, because they looked as like, why is she in this relationship with it? And it's not because of strength necessarily.
Was
I would
she
argue she had some strength too.
Well,
there is such a thing as strength of endurance.
Well, and she was gonna leave. She lied.
She had some endurance because she was like she was suffering from like fevers and all sorts of sickness while she was on there fainting, and she was a trooper. I give Shelley Duvall my utmost respect for what she did and how she was able to get the performance she was able to get out. Right. I felt like that was what ultimately caused her to break mentally in the end. But I do feel like
I wasn't sure if we were talking about her for real or her character, but I was gonna say her character showed some pretty strong attributes. She was gonna leave the hotel, she just didn't have a way out.
Well, I mean, she said she was going to leave, but was she really going to be able to get out? I mean, again,
she was gonna try. She was out there willing to try.
But we could keep going back and forth on that for a while.
I'm trying to see what else we can cover. You know,
I did. Am I even coming through?
Yeah, you're coming through.
Okay, I've been trying to say something for like 20 minutes. I can't get through. Well, I was just going to mention one other thing that, as far as the idea of was she being, maybe was he being a little over aggressive in his directorial style or whatever? One thing that hasn't been mentioned exactly is that he was infamous for taking lots and lots and lots and lots of takes of every single shot.
I have a comment about that when you're done.
I remember reading an interview with Lily Sobieski about Eyes Wide Shut. She was in 2 minutes in that movie, and I think worked for more than 2 weeks solid on that little bit. But one thing, a little anecdote that I read about this one, getting back to Scatman Crothers, he was 70 when they filmed this movie. I mean, he wasn't exactly spring chicken either, and they were having him do the same thing, 30, 40 takes for every shot.
There was a specific scene that he took 147 takes of Scatman Crothers while he was talking to Danny about The Shining.
Right. And then I read a fun anecdote, though. One director who's famous for the exact opposite approach is Clint Eastwood.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a movie in a month. And I read that the next film Crothers did after this was a Clint Eastwood movie. And he did a take, and Eastwood was like, okay, we're good. We're going to the next. And he sat down and broke down in tears of joy that he got it in one take. Just because what they had been gone through on The Shining.
So there was a reason for that.
Holy crap!
Well, no, there were two reasons for that. One, Malcolm McDowell asked Kubrick what his style was as a director, and he said, "I really don't know. I never know what I want, but I do know what I don't want." And so he was trying to kind of whittle it all down to figure out. And Nicole Kidman elaborated on this. She was saying how he was always looking for something that surprised him. And I think it was because he was so smart that there wasn't a whole lot that did surprise him. And so he kept looking for, and he would also say, I want the magic, and that's a very kind of intangible concept. But let me tell you, as a director, when it's there, and it is magic. And that's what we all strive for, is to find the magic. And in a film any of his films, I think part of it is also to try and get people into a state where they're not really thinking about it too much and they're just doing. And, it's like getting past the conscious mind. And I think that's an interesting technique. I tend to be more of the fewer takes is better so people don't get worn out kind of thing. But I can see it the other way too.
Well, and artistically, it gives you so many options.
Yeah,
Like when you're going back and editing things together, like you have options that
exactly.
They said somewhere like it was he never had to have like think about a second thought. Like he got it all. Everything was on film, so there was never going back to damn. I wish I would have kept that one or whatever.
Or having
a rebuttal to that.
Having to do pickups or anything like that.
Go ahead.
A rebuttal to that is in one of the interviews I've heard with different filmmakers. I can't remember exactly who said this, but I think it applies like perfectly here. So like they talked about how like ridiculous they thought it was. Like it's like, oh, I heard. Let's just use Kubrick as an example. Oh, I heard Kubrick did like 55 takes on so and so scene, and it's like, really? Like you messed it up that many times? Like was the 55th take really better than like the 20th take? Like that's just going too far.
They talk about pushing an actor to their breaking point or whatever, like Dane was saying, where it's like you get them to a certain point where they get really good and then they get tired and then they start coming up with all kinds of shit like weird facial expressions and different things because they're running. It's like, what else do you want? I can't do it any differently. And so they really dig deep for something different. So they said in the documentary that most of Nicholson's scenes that they used were like take 27 or whatever, like what once he got to a certain point in his acting, it's like you have to sort of push over that hump. And I get that as a performer. I understand that idea, like, because when I perform a burlesque number so many times, like I can either, like, especially in a rehearsal, I get to a point where I get tired and I'm no longer any good, but there's like a sweet spot, and I can see how that works with acting and shooting a movie. I don't know if the sweet spot is, take 50, but maybe for some people.
I mean, I get the idea, but I just can't view it as anything
formula for it. Otherwise, we would all be genius directors. It just really depends on the actor, depends on the director, depends on what they can bring to it, because you can get magic on the very first take, you can get magic on the 50th take. It just really depends. There's no magic formula to it.
I do think it's interesting that Kubrick is as much of a perfectionist as he was. He encouraged ad-libbing and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
I understand that here's Johnny's ad-libbed and Kubrick didn't get it, but everyone else did, and so they kept it in. There have been moments here and there, like I know in Dr. Strangelove, I read once that when George C. Scott tripped going across the war room, that was an accident that they liked.
It was.
And one that I was very interested in, to help prep for this, I had one Kubrick film in my collection that I had not watched my copy. So after watching this one, I sat down and rewatched Lolita. And I read an interesting thing where apparently Kubrick would have multiple cameras on Peter Sellers, because Peter Sellers was a famed ad-libber. And he said he always did his best thing first or second take, but he'd have all those cameras so he could get all the shots he needed. And I thought that was real interesting.
Well, yeah, with Dr. Strangelove, he would just, as the Merkin Muffley, the president, he would just say, give him the phone, and he would just say, go, and he just would go off on all these great riffs, and it was great. And I encourage that same thing myself. That's where the magic comes.
Wasn't it true, like, that Danny's whole thing with the finger was actually the child's idea himself?
Might have been. I can't remember exactly.
I
think we got character and plot. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, just because obviously, we haven't. I don't even think we can get to theme, just because we kind of did, but it was just like,
I think there's
way too much to unpack with theme when it comes to Kubrick.
I was gonna say you could have a whole discussion in and of itself.
My only real argument with that is I don't think there's as much to unpack as you would think. Because I think a lot of the breakdowns of Kubrick is almost just kind of projection. Like, I don't think he is some kind of like ultra mastermind, like weaving all of these like plot threads together. Like he has like a like a serial killer detective law where there's like a bunch of stuff connected by string.
Well, you could, if you research Kubrick's other films, I think you'd find that he was, in fact, very aware of what he was doing. But
I have kind of a low opinion of Kubrick, kind of to begin with. Like, I've never liked a Kubrick movie the first time I saw it, and in many cases, not even like the third or fourth time I've seen it. The only Kubrick film I actually enjoy, like consistently, is Clockwork Orange.
I agree.
I've loved every one of his movies, but I'm watching it from the perspective of someone that loves great filmmaking and how to tell a story in a way that no one ever
like art films.
And, well, yeah, I love art films.
As somebody looking at it as a painting
I can't stand them
or as an
personally.
artwork, Kubrick is an excellent director. Like I said, don't take any of the criticism I have to heart when it comes to that. I look at this as he is the ultimate artist. He really is. And theme is how he tells his stories. He puts in many red herrings as well into a lot of his work. It would not surprise me if he put things in there, for instance, the little NASA shirt that Danny wears, things like that, just to screw with the people who think that he faked the moon landing.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure he knows about that. You know, I knew about that at the time. But again, it's just because I don't like it does not mean that I think that it is a bad thing. I just feel like it's, for me, as a person.
That's mostly how I feel too. Like, I want that to be said.
Well, and that's why we have these discussions, because we can get, very passionate about what we think, but it doesn't mean the other person's side of it is invalid. But in the list of things here, there's not really any visual effects to really speak of that I could see.
What do you mean, no visual
effects?
The elevator is his own, or the makeup.
What about the elevator? What about the elevator full of blood? Like, did they do that?
I heard that was real, life size. They used actual theater blood or whatever that's used for close-up shots, like gallons of it.
I was thinking that they might have done a miniature, but I guess not, huh?
Wow. No, it was
full size. And it was real blood. They kill real people for it. No, just kidding.
Yeah.
You're screwing with me. I get it. Where's my
I kind of wanted to mention something. We were talking about the way that Kubrick tells his story through his themes, and I feel like he tells a lot of great stories through his shots that he gets, and how artistically set up they are. And I did learn that he's also a photographer.
Yes.
And I really see the shots that he takes in a photographer sense. I'm not a photographer, but I do have an eye for composition, and I noticed that right away. And I think there's a lot of examples of that, in all of the shots, like the really wide angles. Somebody was saying earlier they thought it was like a goof or something, that the angle was so wide and the people were so small, and it's like,
yeah, that was me.
Okay, yeah, I really felt like that was a great way to illustrate the space,
the scale of the space. Yeah, that's what I thought too. I just thought, to my immediate impression of it was, it's like, wow, they need to zoom in on those guys. Like, to me, it looked kind of like a TV movie. I mean, I was 99% sure that was the point, was to emphasize the space and the vastness of the hotel.
Well, and I feel
where they were. But at the same time, it just
job.
didn't come off. It just didn't come off like that to me right away. You know what I mean?
Keep in mind also, what Kitty said was right. He was a photographer for Look magazine and did a great series of photographs. And if you look at his older films, like Killer's Kiss and The Killing, you see his masterful ability to play with light and how to play with composition. Like, you see that same kind of wide angle tracking to the right shot. You see that in The Killing as well as in The Shining. So, I mean, again, that could be a whole discussion in and of itself, but the point is that his techniques were very learned, they were practiced and deliberate, to the point where, his cinematographer on The Killing thought he didn't know what he was talking about, and he told him very clearly, put the camera where I told you, or get off the set and don't come back. And he did what Kubrick wanted, and it turned out to be a great film. So
I feel like he's great at seeing people in relation to their surroundings and using that to
absolutely.
compose a picture. And he does that several times throughout the film, to the point where I feel like we feel like the Overlook Hotel is really, really big, but also very claustrophobic at the same time. And I
The
think
hotel was a character in and of itself, and to me, it was the best character in the entire film.
Well, there's that line, it's what the house wants, you know?
Yeah.
Like, they made it
I
pretty
mean,
clear.
and of course, the Overlook was a character in the Stephen King book as well, and also probably one of the greatest. But I do feel like Kubrick did an excellent job designing that hotel. He made that hotel, except for the outside shots, obviously. But
Yeah.
as far as inside shots,
been there.
he did an excellent job of making those sets, of outlining it from the carpets to the rooms to even the design of making it change around. Like when Danny's doing the whole thing with the whatever the thing is that he's riding around on, and you're like, this doesn't make sense. Why is he over here? If you're actually trying to put a layout to it, to me. Though I don't think that Stanley Kubrick was trying to... Matter of fact, I think that Stanley Kubrick was trying to make this into a psychological and not a supernatural thriller. Whereas the only thing that they say is supernatural was when Jack was let loose from the pantry. I do agree with the theory that Danny let him go instead. And that there was no supernatural part to this. That Jack was ready to kill the family at stage one, and that this was a planned out effort. But again, this is the thing, that it is the hotel itself was a masterful thing. I mean, I was surprised, Katie, that you didn't talk about the makeup on the woman herself, because that I thought was also an excellent point.
Oh, on the old woman?
For the time period, it looks really great. I had no qualms with any of the effects in this film. I thought they were all really well done.
Yeah. Well, honestly, there weren't all that many like actual visual effects pieces. I mean, mostly it's just how the film is shot, and that's why I kind of de-emphasized it a little bit. But
there were a few that I think we should mention, like the lights outside the windows were. I mean, that lighting was done with light bulbs, like really high powered, however many thousands of watt light bulbs, to make it look like the white outside of the middle of winter. The fog that they use to make everything look really cold.
Even in the maze.
The maze is like salt. And styrofoam was the snow, and the snow was very convincing. And they said it was like 90 degrees in there, and it was like salt and
what about
styrofoam snow?
That ending effect where Jack Nicholson just froze. You know that.
Yeah,
that was pretty funny.
That was
actually one thing that I did think about, which I never really thought of this as an effect so much as it was a cinematography technique, but it was pretty new for the time, was the Steadicam shots.
It was like brand new.
Yeah, Steadicam was new at the time of Halloween, which was only 2 years before, and The Shining uses pretty extensive use of Steadicam, some of the best, particularly in the climax. It's just so smooth, and so there's always such great tracking and movement that you could never do with just a normal track. And there's just something that Kubrick's films have a great sense of kind of directorial omnipotence in terms of how we see the story unfold, and that's a good example of it.
Actually, as far as the camera work too, I did see that documentary I watched with Brandon, the making of. I was impressed by there was one part, the scene in the pantry where Nicholson is trapped in the pantry.
That's my favorite scene, where they're filming him upside down.
And they have that you see in the documentary, Kubrick laying on the ground with the camera. It's like, okay, well, you wouldn't usually envision a director doing that to get the shot, but I was like, okay, well, that's good. Props to him.
Yeah, I noticed that scene stood out to me on this last viewing. Before I watched the documentary or any of that, it stood out to me, the juxtaposition, the fact that he was upside down, you're looking at him from underneath like that. It was very sinister, and there was so much about the composition of that really appealed to me as an artist. It jumped out at me right away. That and the way that the music was intertwined with the scenes and the transitions were two things that really jumped out at me this time around.
Oh
And
yeah.
that scene is not very exciting, but it's probably my favorite just because of that fact.
We
I
can
think
talk about
I think
music.
the music, yeah. Because we kind of need to move along a little bit quicker here, I think.
I'm trying.
'cause I
Wendy
think-
Carlos did the music for this, and she had worked with Kubrick before on Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, the music, at least for me, I think was probably the thing I liked the most about the movie. Like I think most of the events just flat out would have fallen just like flat on their face, like would not have worked like at all without the music, because the music sold everything. And actually, like towards the end, I think a lot of like the real scares is just from like the music. At some point, the music turns on kind of during the psychotic episode, and then it like doesn't stop. And so I think that's what makes those so effective, because I mean, without that music setting the tone, I'd have been laughing my ass off.
Well, but you could have said the same thing about Star Wars. Star Wars wouldn't be what it is without the music. I mean, or Jaws or anything.
I would partly agree with that. Partly.
Well, I mean,
I'm not saying it wouldn't have worked. I'm just saying that it wouldn't be what it is.
It wouldn't have been like tension-inducing or scary, like at least to me. I mean, I don't get scared.
And also keep it
usually anyway, but
keep in mind that Kubrick was also very musically driven. He would use a lot of classical music and pre-existing music to drive a scene, and those were all hand-picked selections.
Yeah, he's like the vampire, like the vampire castle music for the drive up. Like that was an awesome choice. Like I think that's my favorite theme.
It set the scene.
The old Ludwig van.
Yeah,
or
like Wendy Carlos listened to Stravinsky's music and Ligeti, and as inspirations for the score.
Yeah,
as well as atonal stuff, which I really think is cool.
I kind of want to pick it up if I can find it like on vinyl or something.
Yeah. We already mentioned some favorite bits.
I had lots of favorites.
I know.
I think I have my favorite written down here because I actually took notes here. Somebody can go while I search my sheet.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll go ahead and say, because I don't think we even mentioned this character, but one of my favorite scenes is the scene in that garish, hideous bathroom.
Yes.
And Grady was great as a spokesperson for the hotel. He was as a voice of the hotel. He had that nice British accent, but he was so evil. And it was like that, and that was one of the few scenes where I felt like Jack Nicholson was actually, it came down a little bit from the crazy. He was still crazy, but he felt, I liked his performance in that scene better than most of the movie.
Oh, he felt more real.
He was using his customer service voice in that one. He's very customer service.
Yeah.
But, I mean,
that's probably my favorite scene, too.
The line, him saying that line, which also, by the way, was from the book, if I remember correctly. You have always been the caretaker here. That line, I probably messed it up, but it was in that thing. To me, though, it was a very powerful line, and again, that was one of the few things that he did take from the books. Is Kubrick did take certain scenes and he did take the dialogue line for line, like the bar, some of the bar scenes, some of this scene, and again, it was to me. I agree. The bathroom scene was definitely, to me, one of the more powerful and well acted scenes in the movie.
Well, I like. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mentioned really liking the pantry scene, and I also, I think probably the first or second time I saw this movie, the scene that really stood out to me then was when Wendy discovers the typewriter and what he's been writing all the same lines, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, over and over, and just the impact of that scene was really big, I think, when I first saw the movie. And then I was thinking about it on this last viewing, and I'm like, wow, somebody had to type all of that out. It was actually done on a typewriter. I have a friend who has an old typewriter, and I sat down and used it, and it's like, wow, yeah, that's right. This is what it's like. It's a lot more work than
I used to have
word
to type
processing.
contracts on an old typewriter, so I understand that. And
The secretary spent months on that, supposedly.
But I do. But we've already defined that Kubrick is fine with torturing his actors to get what, and his staff to get what he needs.
Well,
perhaps he typed it himself. Didn't he have a typewriter? Didn't he type up lines for new lines like every day they shot? He was changing things around.
That reminded me actually of the very quickly of the fact that we see Jack's picture at the end, and kind of the idea that his soul keeps being drawn back to this place, or on a larger thematic level that these same cycles of abuse and of conquest and death and all that they keep coming back. It's a never-ending cycle.
I thought that was just like I interpreted that as like he somehow like went back in time, like when he walked into the room and the party was happening, like he somehow was in, like, what was it, 1921 or whatever. Like, I thought it was just like a typical like ghost movie twist. Like, I didn't even have a coherent theory of what that was until like this viewing, and it's like, oh, maybe that's it. Because I mean, sorry to admit, but that kind of perplexed me for a while.
And I think it was meant to.
There's the whole there's that whole supposed Holocaust connection where you can almost see the Adolf Hitler picture as it fades out into frame, which is kind of an interesting, weird thought. But again,
I totally missed that. What are you talking about?
Again, it's thematic stuff. Whether he intentionally put that in there or he didn't put it in there, and some people are artistically reading it, that's where the art begins and ends. It never ends.
Discussion. Did everyone else say their favorite scenes?
Well, I didn't. I'm trying to remember mine. Dave.
One of my favorite scenes was when he was sitting in front of the bar and talking to Lloyd. When you think about drinking, your bartender is your actual soul consoler. Kind of like your psychologist when you're going and taking a drink. Oftentimes, some of the best people are bartenders. My fiance was a bartender when I first met her, so. But that's besides the case. But I liked the way that he spoke to him, and then he once he seemed like he was getting a little bit more drunk, he danced just a little bit of a jig.
So. Anything else anyone would like to add?
I think my favorite scene is maybe just like the classic, come play with us, like with the twins. Because I actually didn't remember exactly what happened in that scene. Like, it's such like a classic thing that's been parodied so many times. It's like I remember the line, but I didn't remember it like cuts to like their bodies. Like,
yeah,
I wasn't quite expecting it, and I actually laughed pretty hard. It's like, what the fuck was that? Kind of like that. And so I think that was my favorite moment on this rewatch.
Cool.
Really nice acts. Trick or Treat Studios is doing stuff for The Shining this year, and I might get myself a Shining axe.
Cool.
Actually, I guess my current axe. Except this one has like a lot more detail. If my camera, Jesus.
Anybody got anything else to add? Otherwise, we can start to wrap it up a bit.
One more.
We should probably.
Oh, I just want to say one more thing as far as enjoyment of the film and whatnot. This doesn't apply to this viewing, but this applies to the time I saw it in theaters. It was a midnight showing, and I don't know if you guys do a lot of those, but they can be real rowdy sometimes.
Oh,
But
yes.
this was dead quiet. The whole theater was dead quiet. Every now and then people would go, or, the kind of, every now and then. But there was one random guy that every time the black title screens came up, he would yell out in fright. Only for those scenes. He was quiet the rest of the time. And I just
Weirdo.
Amusing. So it made it for a very interesting viewing.
Was this a bird showing that you're talking about, Jacob?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. They're very rowdy during those showings, so that's quite amazing.
Yeah.
That is a very amazing thought when it comes to that.
Cool. All right then. Good discussion, everybody. A lot of great viewpoints shared and analyses.
I guess there was one quick random thing. I think
Go
one
ahead.
thing that may have worked against this movie for like my viewing of it was so I took a trip to Colorado before I had seen this, and I saw the hotel itself like in person before I saw the movie. And so I think part of why the isolation thing didn't quite work on me is because I know that like in the opposite direction right off camera there's like, what was it, like Estes Park or whatever that town is called. It's like I know there's like a city like 100 feet away from the
If you're
thing.
talking about the exteriors, yes, but the interiors were all in a soundstage.
Well, it's still you understand why it kind of why it might have broken the illusion a little bit.
I guess
a little bit.
Kind of a reach. You might want to stretch before you make that reach, buddy.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a stretch too, but at any rate,
I mean, it didn't look as isolated from the exterior, as they said. Like it looked, I mean, in the film, like it didn't look like it was like on the top of like an isolated mountain. Like
I
the
know
parking
they
lot
did
and
a
stuff
great
looked
job.
connected to it.
The 80s.
And just kind of like knowing. Well, hopefully somebody understands the point I'm failing to make.
At the time,
this shows what a great job they did making it look isolated.
Yeah. So sometimes reality can dispel the illusion temporarily, or for some people in the long term. But not everybody.
I understand that several decades ago, when it's quite possible that there wasn't many people in existence near the hotel, possibly.
Well, I mean, it was just like a thing, like for my experience, for seeing the film. So
and I actually stayed in a hotel in the North Carolina mountains that looked very similar to the Overlook. So I think that's kind of funny.
Yeah, like I think I got it. I think my favorite part of this viewing was watching The Simpsons Shining from Treehouse of Horror 5, like right afterwards. It's like, haha.
That doesn't count.
Do you want to get sued?
The Shinning. I think didn't we almost call this episode The Shinning?
Yeah.
We should still do that. Can we still do that?
That's up to Dave.
Like I also like the little thing in here. It's like, hey, me and the other ghouls are worried the project may not be coming along, and like Demon Mo and like Freddy and Pinhead like come and drag Homer out. Like I kind of
shinning. Each one of us has to kick each other in the shins.
So I think we should probably start wrapping it up.
Yeah.
Yep.
So this was a good time, and I'm, even though I was like skeptical about, it's like, oh man, The Shining, it's like, this was a lot better than I remembered, and I'm kind of happy to be wrong. It's just, again, be a little bit more objective, I think. Greatest film of all time.
On tape. I'm glad this is recorded.
Well, greatest film of all time, indisputably, absolutely not. Good movie? Yeah. Just, be earnest.
So who would like to start with who they are and what they're all about?
I'll go. I'm ready. I'm Katie Cadaver from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a body positive horror artist and alternative model. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Patreon, Twitter. I'm on there. I'm on all the socials. So come and find me. I'm also the makeup artist for the horror punk band Rat Bat Spider. You can listen to them at ratbatspider.bandcamp.com. I'm a dead girl for Dead Girls Dark Coffin Classics horror TV show, and you can watch episodes at vimeo.com/ddcc. And if you are a band local to the Milwaukee, Chicago area, hit us up on Facebook at Dead Girls Dark Coffin Classics if you'd like to be on the show. I'm also a performer and producer for Grindhouse Tees Burlesque Productions. You can find us at facebook.com/Grindhouse Tees, and we are also looking for bands that are interested in being in some shows this year with us and performers. So you can contact us on the Facebook page. I am also a Tromet with Trauma Entertainment. You can get all your trauma at trauma.com. And I'm an editor for Movies Galore of Milwaukee. I think next week I have to host the episode. We're doing Groundhog Day, right?
Think you're right.
I think so.
Maybe.
Brandon, you want to go?
I run a channel called Septum Sen versus the World, and we are a physical media channel. We all appreciate all of the world of physical media, be it DVDs, Blu-rays, 4K, VHS, CDs, all of the above. In any case, we also like to do reviews. We talk about upcoming releases and, of course, our lovely top 15s. Because it is award season, we are trying to be in the award season mood by talking about the various nominees and going over awards-themed lists over the month of February. So I hope you all stay tuned and get some enjoyment out of our work.
Cool. Jake?
All right. I frequently guest on Septum Sin versus the World. And as Brandon said, most recent top 15 was the best original opening theme songs from TV shows that did not have words. That's a lot of words for saying that, but musical opening themes. And next week, we intend to do a list of the 15 people who are vastly overdue for an Oscar nomination. And of course, we will have a lot to say on the Oscar, and we will hit the Golden Raspberry nominations as well. Yay, Mirai and Black Panther. I love what both of them did today. And also, this week I posted one of my rare self-done videos, the second in my Criterion series, for a Russian film called Letter Never Sent, which is how I was starting to feel about most of these videos that get recorded and sit around forever. And I do have my own channel, Kotobuki Jake, which is more devoted to nature and the natural world. And I guess we'll go ahead and say that also you should check out the other posting tonight that I'm sure Dave will have more to say. The other overlong, super artsy film from 1980 that we covered tonight, Kagemusha.
Awesome film. Great discussion.
That we were on about before this episode. So.
And Dustin?
What? Oh, hey. Well, I'm local nutcase, Dustin. I collect anything related to horror and study biology. You can find my pathetic attempts to catalog everything I've been picking up on my Instagram, DHR Hunter. You can also follow me on Twitter at The Crypt of Horrors, which is also the name of my solo YouTube channel, which is for like unboxings and eventually interviews with horror creators or pretty much whoever's willing to come on and talk. So I haven't been updating it very much since it's been a pretty busy winter break, but that's going to change pretty soon. I am also on the Pop Culture Weekly podcast, also here on YouTube, with my friends who run the Twisted Dreams Film Festival. Trying to remember some of the other stuff I do. There's kind of a lot to remember, you know. I'm also an editor for Inside Movies, and at some point, I'm gonna have an interview, some reviews like on there somewhere. So
Cool.
And I guess after this, I'm going to be collecting skulls on Dead by Daylight on Xbox. So if you're playing Survivor, watch your butt.
And probably collecting skulls in real life.
Skulls are expensive, but yeah.
Yeah, they actually are. And I am Dane Kyle. I am an independent filmmaker out of Charlotte, North Carolina. I've got a lot of stuff coming out. A lot of films of mine that are included in anthology films. Those are called For We Are Many, Clownsploitation, which is on Troma right now, Drive-In Grindhouse, and Creepypasta, the movie. We're going to be filming another short film to be included in another anthology, and I'm trying to get my first feature up and running. And and also directing my girlfriend's Harley Quinn fan series called Asylum Origins Harley. So keep an eye out for that this summer. And I'll try and hand it over to David to close us out.
Awesome. And my name is David Strege. I run Inside Movies Galore, but I run it with all of you these days.
Hooray!
We're
special.
This has been a Inside Movies Galore great episode. I think everyone can say goodnight.
Night.
Like, share, and subscribe.
Stay tuned for Groundhog's Day. And if I see, and of course, if we're still doing The Shining on Groundhog's Day, over and over and over.
Oh, fuck that. I mean, yeah, it's a good movie. It's just, you don't want to watch it like 10 times in a row, you know? It's already kind of an endurance challenge.
But I should know, David, I've always been here.
Yeah. You've always been the caretaker, Mr. Grady.